Welcome everyone to another module and a training that has to do with the VNAV arrival and approach. Before we get into it, I want to emphasize this will be an actual continuation from the setup on this particular arrival and approach into Orlando to runway 17 right, an LNAV, VNAV approach or RNAV approach. What I would like to emphasize is a couple things before we get started on this. That is part of what is so important for a professional pilot. And I've said it before, you're going to hear this a lot, situational awareness. Now, situational awareness incorporates a number of different aspects, but in the case of what we're doing here, where we're making an arrival into a busy airport, the biggest thing you want to be doing in terms of anticipating is to think well ahead. I want to emphasize the scans as well. Now, one of the things I've noticed, especially with new pilots, as you're not necessarily familiar with the circumstances of the airplane that you're getting to learn, and therefore some scans and knowing where to look for information can be a little bit challenging. But I found that even with some of us that are more experienced. Now, I want to emphasize scans, and I want to give you an example. If you've got the natural capacity to use scans in your normal life. For instance, if I'm driving an automobile and I'm on a highway, or say a two-lane road, but a highway is a good example. Gang, if I'm not scanning everything that is available to me to see the traffic in front of me, beside me, behind me, and the traffic that's approaching. So for instance, I'm going to give you an example. If I'm driving an automobile on a highway, what is a good scan? If I may be spending 50% of my time or even less looking out the front, but the rest of the time I'm scanning my right side view mirror, my rear view mirror, my left side mirror, and I'm constantly looking to see how the traffic is flowing toward me or around me or in front of me. And that's a constant scan. And if you're probably within, let's say, just even a 10-second period of time, if you haven't scanned all of that area and constantly doing that, then that's not really a good scan for that condition, let alone that condition is really important under many phases of flight when you're in a cockpit of an airplane. Scans are extremely important. And that example on a highway is something I think that we all can understand and appreciate. The other thing is thinking ahead of the aircraft and anticipating what needs to be monitored and what needs to have some execution actions that may be ahead at various points along the arrival and the approach. Now recognize in this particular situation, VNAV path in the FMA is the most important aspect of constantly monitoring during this arrival and approach. And being in VNAV path in this pitch window prior to the final approach fix is most important. That needs to be the priority, and that needs to be what I'm thinking well ahead. Even in this situation, this is what I need to have VNAV reflected as I approach the final approach fix. So that's thinking ahead of the aircraft, knowing what I must constantly monitor. In the real world, there's a lot of variables that can disrupt maintaining VNAV path during this arrival and approach. In this case here, we're going to make it very vanilla. We're not going to have any of those kinds of circumstances that can happen as we make this arrival and approach. But in the real world, you'll have many of these circumstances and situations come up that may take you out of VNAV path. And we're going to have more modules where I'll introduce some of those variables, and it'll help you practice that scan of doing what you have to do to maintain VNAV path. If you get out of VNAV path, you're going to learn and have the means of being able to get back in VNAV path. You're going to learn how to control VNAV path, especially when you're high, and being able to get back to path. All those things are coming, gang. They're most important in the real world. You don't get that stuff in training. So in any case, we'll be doing a lot of that. But in this case here, this is going to be pure vanilla and have no challenges to it. Now, another important aspect of the mental side of flying is to be thinking well ahead of where your present position is, thinking well ahead of the aircraft. That is extremely important. Again, I want to just give you an indication, that in all my time of flying, that's something I had to develop at certain times, and especially with experience on the aircraft. But eventually this becomes an absolute necessity. But I'm going to tell you that this is a weak area that I've seen, especially over recent years, of individuals thinking ahead of the aircraft. And what I'm going to suggest is a good rule of thumb, that you should be a minimum of at least 20 minutes ahead of your present circumstances and operational conditions where you are at the present time. Now, there are certain phases of flight that are busy, such as takeoffs, arrivals, and approaches, that require intense activity, where being 10 minutes ahead is sufficient. Certainly at cruise altitude, under normal conditions, there is a more relaxed atmosphere in most cases, and the intensity of staying ahead of the aircraft is not as necessary. However, if you're in a situation or a condition where the destination or some areas along the route require anticipation of those conditions, you can stay ahead and well ahead of time. Don't wait until you get into the area that requires some decision making or gathering of some information that could have been gotten well ahead of time. That's the way we're talking about thinking ahead. Most important. In this particular scenario, in this module, my general objective from the time I start the arrival to being assured that I have VNAV path in my FMA 3 to 5 miles before the final approach fix. This would be regardless of any of the circumstances that could have disrupted maintaining VNAV path during the arrival. Now, this is something I covered previously, and I want to reemphasize here. If for any reason you lose VNAV path, and this is again thinking ahead and monitoring that would catch this, when I get to level flight, what I want to do is to go to the cruise page. If I lose VNAV path and I had it, or if I don't have it and I'm not able to re-engage VNAV, remember what I said in a previous lesson. Go to the cruise page, enter the altitude that you're maintaining, a level flight altitude, execute it in the FMA, see that altitude turns magenta in your FMC, go to VNAV, and that'll put you back on path. You need to be ready to do that in an instant. Be constantly monitoring that. I need to know how to get back in VNAV path, especially the closer I get to the actual approach. Remember that. All right, so now we're on the arrival here, and in this particular case here, gang, what I'm going to mention to you is that we have just been cleared to this altitude without being cleared for the arrival. Generally, that would be done well up at altitude, but in this case here, we don't have VNAV path. So what I want to do in this case here is look to get into VNAV path. What I need to do is be prepared for that when they clear me to a lower altitude. In this case, they've got us at 9,000 feet. So with this, what we're going to do, all right, gang, here we are now on this arrival, and what we're going to do is start our or arrival. So at this point, what we're going to do is get clearance to 3,000 feet. So they've cleared us to 3,000 feet. I notice that I have VNAV path and FMC speed. So everything I'm doing here is based on the FMC. But I have to have a lower altitude in here. So what I want to do is set a lower altitude that I'm cleared to 3,000 feet. So I'm going to go to the mode control panel altitude window, and I'm going to set that altitude above the tape, not in the altitude window. So I have 3,000 feet here. Now notice out here, gang, what I have is this top of descent. So it's pilot's discretion to 3,000 feet. That's what we'll assume we've been given here. We got back to 9,000 feet. We're 240 knots. Now, what I want you to notice here too is that we are continuing this route. This is one of the fixes for 17 right, and I see that it's 33,000 feet or above. So this clearance should put us in pretty good position, but I know that I'm going to have to slow down during this as well. So anyway, right now, this is telling us we've got 12 miles to the top of descent, this on this cruise page here. Okay, so you're always getting information in here. Learn to use these pages here in order to be able to discern some information. Now, one of the things I recommended is that you go to the descent page. Notice here on this descent page, I don't have anything populated in my flight path angle, vertical bearing, and vertical speed yet, but I will once I get to the top of descent. And notice it's also giving me the disk to the top of that descent. I want you to notice what happens when we reach the top of descent, what's going to happen in the FMA. Now again, be scanning everything. I can see that I can take nav display over here on the right and kind of reduce it with some more definition like I have on the left. Now again, scan, scan, scan. How am I doing on speed? It is slowing to that 240 knots. I do have the right indications I'm looking for here. I've got good scaling both here and here. And what I'm going to do is anticipate top of descent here in another 3 miles. And when that happens, I want to see that the throttle starts to come back toward idle, which will first say retard in green here. And we're going to be VNAV path here. But notice that what's going to happen is we're going to get a scale here that's going to help us understand on a nav display how we're doing on path. We'll also have that in the primary flight display. But we're going to have a lot of that same information just populated. We got to the top of descent. I've got the scale on my nav display. I've got my pointer here. Notice the power is coming back. And I can see that the power is coming back. Soon it'll be at idle. Now, what is most important here to be able to maintain that path is I see flight path angle and vertical bearing are close, and it's pretty much staying on path, but I'm just a little high on path, and we're really doing well here. This drag required is because the airspeed is increasing. So I need to be ready to use my speed brake, and it's always a little sensitive in this thing here to be able to get it to operate. So I'm going to use a full speed brake here, which I shouldn't have to use in the real world. But in any case, I can start to see here now that I can look at this green arc and I can see that I'm going to be at 3,000 feet where that beginning of that approach is over here on 17 right. Now, with that, I also need to be anticipating, thinking ahead. I'm going to have to slow down for this approach as well. So what I'm going to do is constantly be thinking about scaling correctly here. Give yourself good definition here. So what I've got is a flight path angle that's a little bit better than vertical bearing, and that vertical bearing is calculating to Orlando, but I'm going to have to go to Elaine. So the clearance now is going to be your cleared direct Elaine. So what I'm going to do is have my partner give me a direct lane, ask me to confirm it, and I'm going to execute it, and then I'm going to see my LNAV here. Okay, yes. Now notice what's happened here. The power is back. I have VNAV speed here now. Now, what happened to take me out of VNAV speed? If I go to this cruise altitude here, notice what's happened. I've lost my calculation. So what I want to do when I get to 3,000 feet, and what I can do, anticipation of that, is put 3,000 feet in the scratch pad and be ready to enter it once we level off. So we're out of 4 for 3. I can see that I'm going to be at 3,000 feet well before I need to. And again, be looking to have good pages here. Scale your nav display. This nav display is my best situational tool. Remember we talked about that, okay? Notice that I'm still high here on my calculation. This says I'm going to start to decelerate, okay? So what I'm probably going to have to do in many of these cases here, notice what's happened on my FMA. I'm now all the way back to idle. I can't do anything more with my power. I'm back on path. So in this case here, I don't need to do anything because I got back on path. The system took me to path. This has a geometrical program in it, and that's an extremely valuable. Okay, I didn't have an approach ref in there, so I kind of had to change that. What I really want to start to do is extend my flaps here. You can see how busy we're going to be here. I can see in my speed here, I'm at the up speed here. I'm approaching lane. I'm sent over to tower. And now what I want to do, since I'm in VNAV alt here, what I want to set is the final approach fix altitude. In this case here, I'm going to set 1,600 feet. Notice I went back into VNAV path. Take my heading up. You can see how busy we are here and how scans are so important. So what I'm trying to do is get my heading up here, okay? And now what I want to do is go to flaps 5. And notice how that's automatically doing that here in VNAV path. So my flaps are continuing to extend. I now have the bug back here at 5. I'm approaching the final approach fix. I want to put the landing gear down. I want to go to flaps 15. And what I want to do is set a missed approach altitude. So in this case here, I'm going to set 3,000 feet. I'm in VNAV path. I'm slowing to flaps 30. I come across the final approach fix here. I'm slowing to ref. I'm in VNAV path. I don't necessarily need this drag required. We're pretty much at speed. I pass the final approach fix. And I'm now in my descent to the runway, 17 right. Now, the one thing I want you to understand here, too, see how busy you are here. We're coming up on 1,000 feet. Your airlines are probably going to have calls at some of these points here. I always like to take my scale down to the best definition I can. And in this case here, I want the 5 mile range, which gives me the best definition on my magenta line and on my approach to the runway. One thing that I need to do is get this back up to arm. Okay, there we go. In any case, the thing that I want to emphasize here too, gang, notice that we're right on path. It shows we're right on path here with flight path angle, vertical bearing. I'm looking really good. So this is going to take us down to is 50 feet above the runway threshold. That's what VNAV path calculates for you. You'll have some calls along the way, confirm that your landing gear is down, your flaps final configuration, your speed brake is armed. And in this case here, because operating a speed brake in this particular simulator is a little bit difficult. Now notice, I'm pausing it here now, that what this did, we're a little bit high based on the VASI. And when you are in a position on the approach where you're, in this case here, the path has got us a little bit high, But when you can transition to the VASIs in visual conditions, make a gradual transition to go to the VASIs. Remember, RNAV approaches are not precision approaches. They're really very good, and they're darn close to that. Again, this is a simulator, so, it doesn't necessarily have the greatest of precision like it does in the real world. But the thing that I want to point out here, gang, is this is here's the things you want to be looking at. I want to constantly monitor this. I want to constantly stay ahead with speed and configuration. Remember in VNAV, once I take the flaps to the position that desires, the speed bug is automatically going to go back and set at whatever that flap setting is. You don't have to call for, or you don't have to go up to the speed window and change that. It's all being calculated here in VNAV. So the important scans for this approach is your VNAV descent page. How am I doing on path that I have these visual indications? I want to constantly be monitoring this. I want to constantly be staying ahead of the aircraft with nav displays and constantly increase that scan of all the instrumentation. And remember that once you get in position where you have VASIs, you can start to alter your descent profile if I have to get back into a red over white condition 2/2. So just go ahead and make sure that you gradually do that so that you land within the touchdown zone. Now, another thing that I want to point out, and this is especially important in training, but even more important in the real world, this is a long runway. There's a tendency to really be sloppy about landing in a touchdown zone. Remember, the touchdown zone on any runway is from 1,000 to 1,500 feet. Now, there's a lot of other markings here, but don't float. That's most important, to really start to develop a discipline to land in the touchdown zone. Now, that's pretty easy to do in visual conditions. It's maybe a little bit more difficult in instrument conditions, but get in the habit of making that discipline something that you constantly work on, is to land within the first 1,500 feet of the runway. And in some cases, you'll be operating in even shorter runways, and you probably want to be more toward that 1,000 feet. And in some cases, maybe a little bit before. But plan on those things. Anticipate those things, like I said. Know which airport you're going into, know what runway you're going into, and what the conditions are of the runway. All right, gang, this is it for this session. I hope there's maybe been some valuable things that we got out of this. And any questions, any comments, any suggestions, please let us know.